Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Debs at War, How Wartime Changed Their Lives, by Decourcy, narrated by Rachel Atkins.
Preface. History is made all the time, not just by the noisy clash of politics, economic currents or overpowering personalities, but by the everyday texture and attitudes of contemporary life. Things impossible to judge accurately from the standpoint of hindsight. It is generally accepted that the words and writings of those who actually lived through a period are an invaluable historical contribution and help to bring it truly to life. Within a decade or two, the era before the Second World War, and a little later the war itself, will become what is known as history. That is, there will be no one alive who can actually remember these years, and how radically different they were from life as it is now lived. Stoicism is only one of the national qualities that seems to have disappeared. The women I spoke to for this book described a society quite unlike the Britain of today. For them, the contrast between their peacetime lives and the war was sharper than for any other section of British society. They had been brought up largely in isolation from anyone not of their particular background, in conditions of material privilege, yet often at a physical and emotional distance from their parents, unknown in any other stratum of society, and with a code that regarded making a fuss, which included making oneself conspicuous as well as complaints, as something not to be tolerated. All of them had been debutantes in the years before the war. They had made their curtsy before the King and Queen and become fully fledged members of the social class in which they had been brought up. Until they emerged into this adult world, they had been protected, cocooned, and kept in chaste ignorance under their parents' sway, conditions that often lasted until their expected destiny, marriage. When war broke out, with or without parental approval, they rushed to join up rather than wait for call-up papers. Indeed, many had begun what became their wartime work or service as soon as their age permitted, well before hostilities began. The realities of war and the accompanying culture shock liberated many from the straitjacket of their upbringing, giving the confidence that comes from successfully coping with challenges and responsibility on one's own. Their voices are the experiences of a minority which, though small, was not an insignificant element of the complex social history that has produced the country we are today. As such, they deserve to be heard. Decourcy, London and Gloucestershire, January 2005. Chapter 1. Childhoods. Taken down to say good morning to our mothers. All over England, the daughters of the upper classes were growing up in similar fashion. Although it was received wisdom in the 20s and 30s that the 1914-18 war, the Great War as it was known, had changed everything, shattering the rigid social hierarchy and formal etiquette of pre-war Edwardian days, in practice, very little had altered. There were superficial changes. The parents of these girls now drank cocktails, danced in smart restaurants, wore shorter, less constricting clothes, went to the cinema and visited the French Riviera in the summer, all unheard of in that distant, golden, pre-war era. But underlying these activities, the customs and practices of their world remained very much the same. The demands of the social calendar, with its emphasis on sporting activities, dominated many of their lives. As one contemporary source points out, when people in high society in those days spoke of economizing, it usually meant making do with one footman instead of two, or giving up the undergardener. and most still lived in anything from stately homes or places, the next down to halls, manors, or pleasant country houses. Some lived permanently in the country, renting a London house or availing themselves of the hospitality of a London-based relation, only for the season when a daughter was being brought out, that is, making the transition from schoolroom to grown-up world via presentation at court and attendance at as many balls, dances, and social events as possible. Grander families had their own townhouses, opened only for a few months each summer, some palatial, all big enough to hold a dance. For many years as a child, Lady Margaret, Meg Egerton, did not dare explore the whole of Bridgewater House in St. James's, the immense London mansion of her parents, Lord and Lady Ellesmere. I was far too frightened of getting lost to go into the back premises or the remoter rooms. Such houses were, of course, staffed by servants who carried out all the work of the household, a fact that was still taken for granted. In 1939, the number of domestic servants stood at around 1.25 million, both by the very rich and by those who described themselves as not having much money. Mary Pollock's doctor-father, a distinguished paediatrician, kept a butler, cook, housemaid, nanny, and nursery maid at the family house in Evelyn Gardens, although Mary described her family as being not particularly well off. In Scotland, the Ellesmeres had around 30 servants, including a house carpenter and grooms, taking some of them to Bridgewater House from May to the end of July when they came to London for the season. At one stage, when the 6 Egerton girls were growing up, the Bridgewater staff included 3 ladies' maids. "I was 4 when I first went to Bridgewater House," recalled Meg Egerton. "A whole carriage in the train was hired, and we came down with Nanny. The butler, the cook, and the footman came, but the housemaids stayed at Merton. There was already a housekeeper and resident staff at Bridgewater House, with a hall porter who would double as a footman. We brought our chauffeur down as well, but we also had another one in London because there was so much going on." At Warwick House in St. James's, the London home of the Honourable Esmond Harmsworth, there was a butler, 3 footmen, an under-butler, a housekeeper, and a number of maids. "One didn't know them except for their surnames," said his daughter Lorna. "The kitchen had a cook and kitchen maids, and my father had 3 chauffeurs. One who worked for the family, my father's personal one, and one of the staff who took things down to our house in the country or brought things back from the greenhouses." Other houses were like little villages. At Wentworth in South Yorkshire, the largest house in England, surrounded by lawns black with coal dust from the adjacent mines, the corridors were so long and the turnings so complicated that the footman who showed guests to their rooms would unwind a ball of string to enable them to find their way back to the drawing-room. Sheila Parish's mother was the favourite granddaughter of the great Prime Minister, William Ewart Gladstone, and her rich Gladstone uncle and his wife, who had no children, lived at the old family home, Hawarden Castle in Flintshire. We were treated as their children and went there for all our holidays. We had ponies and a swimming pool in the garden, and when we grew out of that, he made a lake for us. In London, we had a reasonable-sized staff: cook, kitchen maid, parlour maid, housemaid, batman, my father had been in the army, nanny, nursery maid, and daily. But at Hawarden, the staff was enormous: 2 butlers, 4 in the kitchen, 4 housemaids, 20 in the garden, and lots out in the park and farms. At Christmas, all the staff families came in, and there was an enormous tea, after which we and the village children acted in a nativity play. Then we stood around a vast Christmas tree, with gardeners holding sponges on sticks to douse the candles when they got too low, while we gave out presents to the children. There must have been 150 of them. Then we all sang carols. We had 9 servants inside, 2 pantry, 3 kitchen, 2 upstairs, said Cynthia Denison Pender. But I never had any feeling of belonging to a privileged class. Our staff were my friends. They didn't tell my parents if I'd done something wrong, and for my 21st, they all gave me something special. Aristocratic households, especially those of the older generation, often maintain the formality of an earlier era. When Lady Barbara Legge and her sisters and brother stayed with their grandparents, the Earl and Countess of Dartmouth, they went out for picnics in a brougham, driven by a coachman, with a small boy wearing a top hat standing at the back, ready to spring down and open gates. Most housework in the 1930s was done by hand, chiefly by housemaids in their cotton print uniforms. Vacuum cleaners had been invented, but many employers thought them newfangled. Servants could be dismissed without notice for such crimes as immorality. Maids were quite often found in bed with footmen, unsurprisingly, as the latter were frequently chosen for their looks, dishonesty, or drunkenness. This last was a particular hazard for butlers who had charge of the wine cellar. Our first butler was dismissed after shutting himself in the cellar when my parents were away and systematically drinking one bottle of wine after another while filling the empties with his urine, recalled Esme Harmsworth, sister of Lorna. Cold was a routine fact of life. No cars, let alone aeroplanes, were heated. Few houses had central heating. Draught exclusion was a phrase as yet unknown, and year-round open windows were considered healthy. "Nobody would come and stay with us in winter," said Barbara Legge, as our house, Godmersham Park, between Canterbury and Ashford, was the coldest house imaginable. Society, in the sense of society, was much smaller and almost entirely class-based. That is, the people written about by the gossip columnists of the day were a smallish network of the rich, titled and influential, sometimes infiltrated by the famous or the very determined. Column inches filled today by celebrities then featured elegant or titled members of the upper classes as icons of success or glamour. Young and beautiful peeresses were used to advertise the virtues of cold cream, or, if socially prominent, that is, figuring in magazines like the Tatler, Sketch or Bystander that chronicled the doings of this small group in gushing prose, were lent clothes by the grandest couturiers to wear in the London season, or at country house parties, in the same way that Hollywood designers today dress actresses for the Oscar award ceremony. Pictures of the aristocracy at play, Lords, a polo match, Ascot, were a spectacle for the public. Debutantes learnt this early, when crowds lined the Mall on presentation court days, peering in at car windows as the procession of chauffeur-driven cars inched its way towards the gates of Buckingham Palace and gave their verdict on the occupants. For this small, exclusive and self-recognising set, social ostracism was a form of death. Divorce, for example, carried such a stigma that no divorced person was allowed into that holy of holies, the royal enclosure at Ascot, where all their friends were meeting and greeting. When Betty Shaughnessy, then Lady Grenfell, was divorced from her first husband shortly before the Second World War, her stepfather, the courtier Joey Lee, asked her to go and tell the King and Queen herself at Windsor. I remember this awful thing, going up by myself to their part of the castle. Luckily, the King, who was terribly sweet, was at a meeting. I went in to the Queen in her boudoir. "This is all very sad," she said. "Sit down, Betty. I just hope that you'll be happy and the dear children won't be too upset. These awful rules. You won't be able to come to official parties now, you know, but of course privately you still will." Then she sighed and continued, "I know you love racing." I said, "Yes, Ma'am. I know. I won't be allowed in the royal enclosure." Within the home, children led a life almost completely separate from their parents. For younger children, this took place mainly in their day and night nurseries, or in larger houses, the nursery wing, with formal visits to their mother and father after tea. Primped, starched, brushed and combed by a nanny, they would enter the drawing-room to greet the two adults who had given birth to them. "You didn't really want to go downstairs to see them after tea," said Mary Edgerton. They didn't play with us children. We sat in the drawing room, 7 of us on the sofa, then shot out of the room like scolded cats, back to the Red Landing. Once through the glass door at our end, you were in heaven. You were in the nursery wing. Even as they grew older, many children led such separate lives from adults that for hours no one might know where they were. Lady Margaret, who spent 9 months of the year in Merton, the Adam house on the banks of the Tweed, bought by her father in 1913, ran wild most of the time. Nobody bothered where you went. We climbed enormous pine trees and couldn't get down and made omelettes out of birds' eggs. The river was actually quite dangerous if one had slipped down that bank. Yet even in the remoter parts of Scotland or rural England, there was one great link with other children: the weekly or monthly dancing class in the local county or market town. We lived in tweed kilts, jerseys and Burberrys, said Jean Faulkner of her Galloway childhood. We had nothing much else except the velvet party dresses and bronze shoes which we wore to dancing class every month. In London, the favoured dancing teacher was Miss Vacani. She was very small and wore enormous high heels, said Barbara Legg, taken to classes with her younger sister by their nanny. The fascinated children also noted the teacher's unusual underwear. When she demonstrated to us how to twirl when waltzing, her skirt used to fly out and we could see that she was wearing silver knickers decorated with red roses. Children's clothes, though, were utilitarian rather than decorative, conforming to a social ideal rather than to personal taste. Little dresses were smocked by nanny or a mother's lady's maid. Sailor suits were popular for little boys. In winter, jerseys and skirts hid chill-proof vests and pants. We weren't allowed to wear shoes until we were about 10, Barbara recalled. Out of doors in the winter, we wore gaiters with buttons and boots. Wearing boots was supposed to make your ankles strong. Betty Shaughnessy was another who saw little of her parents as a child. We went down to the drawing room, changed after tea for about half an hour, about 5:30 to 6. Sometimes Mummy had people to tea, then we were fetched up to the nursery again. Also, they were away nearly every weekend in the summer, and in the winter too, shooting. Many children learned everything from the daily routine to behaviour from what would nowadays be called the hired help. As a child, one was of course brought up by the servants, not our parents, said Esme Harmsworth. We knew the domestic staff better than anyone else. We had nanny, an undernurse and nursemaid looking after us 3 children. The nurseries themselves were on the wrong side of the green baize door, the twilight zone between the staff and the parents. We didn't have thick carpet like our mother and father. We had linoleum, and the bits of carpet we did have were pretty threadbare, but we were waited on hand and foot. There was a nursery footman. In the morning, when our parents were at home, which wasn't that often, we were taken down to say good morning to our mother for 10 minutes, and then in the evening, if they were in, there was the children's hour. We went down all dressed up. Oh, those nasty, prickly, organdy sleeves, and hair brushed, and Nanny had to shove us through the drawing-room door, as we didn't really want to go in at all. Once there, we had to be seen, but not heard. They were usually either playing bridge or mahjong. When they had visitors, I was terrified. The gulf between even loving parents and their children was enormous. My childhood was very happy, and I was close to my parents, particularly my mother, said Barbara Legg. Did my parents ever cuddle me? Certainly not my father. Twice a year at Christmas and on birthdays he used to play with us, and that was wonderful. My mother always came and said good night to us and heard our prayers. Fortune Smith, very close to her parents, was one of many who only began to have lunch downstairs, in the dining room with her parents, as opposed to the nursery or schoolroom, at the age of 10. I'd just gone to my first day school, and I was so proud of my uniform, I kept my blazer on all day. We had supper in the nursery, and then the schoolroom until quite an old age. I didn't really have dinner downstairs until I was about 15. We had a bedtime all through our lives at home, and I went to bed at 10 really almost until I came out. Fortune and her brother saw more of their parents than many. They were taken to France by their mother and father every Easter holidays to look at the chateau on the Loire, and in the summer, with another family, to a deer forest in Inverness-shire. The concept of teenager, with its specific needs, desires, vocabulary and cultish independent life, had not been invented. Children did what their parents told them and never, ever answered back. "I wasn't really close to my parents," said Jean Faulkner, who on their Galloway sheep farm saw more of hers than most children. "I was terrified of my father. He hardly ever spoke, and when he did, he was very non-committal and brusque, although he could suddenly make the funniest remark. My mother was a matriarch and very bossy. I was in awe of her. What she said went. Her rules were rules. I wouldn't have dared answer her back." Other children found contact with their parents anything from difficult to unhappy. When we became old enough to have dining-room lunch, we used to rehearse in the hall what we would say to our father, as otherwise he wouldn't understand. Said the Honourable Val Canning, the daughter of Lord Garver and granddaughter of the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam. We were also allowed downstairs at tea-time, and we used to have to play those awful board games which I've always hated since. The thing is, my mother doted on my father and hadn't really got a lot of time for us. Parents could be distant to a degree that seems almost sadistic now. "My mother never once came to say good-night to us," said Meg Edgerton, "and I only remember 2 occasions when my father came upstairs to our rooms, once when I had appendicitis at 15, and again when I was ill in London. I don't resent the strictness of our upbringing, but I do resent the lack of affection." Anne Reed was another who suffered, both from fear of her parents and from their remoteness. "Until I came out, I only ever had meals in the dining-room with my mother and father on Christmas Day and Easter Day. These dining-room meals were torture. My father never used physical violence, but mentally he could be very cruel, tremendously sarcastic. My mother was frightened of him, and so were the servants. He was a great stickler for punctuality. If he said, "Be ready in the hall at 11 o'clock, I jolly well had to be there at 5:02, as 11 was considered late. If we left a light on at bedtime, outside my bedroom, there was a frightful scene, and I had to pay a shilling." The one good thing is that, after him, nothing was terrifying, so I've never been frightened of anybody since. Christiane Grant, the daughter of Sir Arthur Grant of Monymusk, was equally terrified. Growing up in a large, icy Scottish castle, often hungry, she was beaten by her father with a cane for real or imagined misdemeanours from time to time, once for hovering outside the dining-room door to eat the scraps that came out from a grown-up dinner party. Such parents occupied their time in ways that have since changed out of all recognition. For many men, sport of some kind served as a work substitute, at least as far as absorbing the drive, energy, intelligence and time that would today have been poured into a career. Building up a shoot, a pack of foxhounds, or a racing stables was a lifetime's occupation. In any case, much social life was based around horses, with hunting prints adorning the walls of country houses and the bookshelves packed with hunting memoirs and the complete works of Surtees and Nimrod. Shooting replaced hunting in counties like Norfolk. The fathers of others were heavily involved in local government or looked after family estates. Rosemary Wynne's father, Arthur Wynne, ran the Reig estate in Denbighshire that belonged to his father, Lord Newborough, though as a second son he would inherit neither it nor the family money needed to maintain it. Some soldiered, in peacetime an altogether more leisurely affair, with plenty of leave for hunting or polo. During the winter there was no question of doing any soldiering, wrote General Sir Cecil Monkey Blacker, then a subaltern in the 5th Inniskillen Dragoon Guards, in his memoir Monkey Business. It was understood that every officer would depart for 2 months to hunt, taking with him his 2 chargers, plus 1 or 2 troop horses, and as many soldier grooms as was needed to look after them. For those who worked in the city, the rewards were good, thanks to the old boy network, while today's frenetic pace and exhausting hours were unknown. The mothers of these children also had to fill their days. A number worked hard at different charities, and in the country ran anything from the village girl guide troupe, often handed on to a daughter, to the Mothers' Union and Moral Welfare Association. Elizabeth Lowry Corey's mother did exquisite embroidery. For the smart set in London, life could be relentlessly frivolous. Appointments at hairdressers, fittings at dressmakers. Most had their clothes made, though ready-made was gradually creeping in. Perhaps cocktails at the Ritz, followed by a luncheon there, a visit to an exhibition, or to a jeweller's to buy a wedding present. Tennis, golf, bridge, and a charity tea or committee. Then it was home, after complaining of exhaustion, to change for dinner. Always a long dress and black tie, even when à deux. Followed by the theatre with supper and dancing afterwards. Betty Shaughnessy's mother, Sarah Lee, who all her life employed a lady's maid, rested on or in her bed every day for at least an hour before facing the rigours of the evening. For the children of these elegant couples, tucked away on the nursery floor, Nanny was, unsurprisingly, the focus of their lives. Most grew up with nanny wisdom and nanny dicta. There's no such word as can't. 2 wrongs don't make a right. No cake till you've had your bread and butter, entering the subconscious of future generations. We adored our nanny, and she was very insistent on good manners, said Sarah Norton, the daughter of Lord Grantley. If there was naughty behaviour at the tea-table, it was, "We did not ask Mr. Rood to tea." Questions like, "Nanny, where are we going?" drew the reply, "There and back to see how far it is, and don't scuff your new shoes." If we asked, "Nanny, how old are you?" she would smile and say, "As old as my tongue, and a little older than my teeth." The pre-war nanny was a quite different figure from the child carer of today. The massive slaughter of fighting men in the 1914-18 war had resulted in a whole generation of single women. The maiden aunts trumpeting through the pages of P.G. Wodehouse were as much a reflection of real life as an inspired creation. And the profession of nanny attracted many who would otherwise have been mothers themselves. With, of course, a few exceptions, this pre-war nanny was a loved, unchanging figure who regarded her employer's children as her own, and often remained with the same family all her life, perhaps moving on to look after the children of one of the daughters when the last of her charges went to boarding school. Betty Shaughnessy was not the only one to claim, "Our nanny was like a mother to us. We confided in her, but not in our parents. They were strangers. We were also very fond of our nursery maid. We would go to Hyde Park with 2 prams, Nanny always pushing the one with the baby in it." Girl children were often lonely. Unlike their brothers, sent away to school, they were frequently governess-educated, the lucky ones in a schoolroom with the daughters of their parents' friends of the same age. "I longed to go to school," said Meg Edgerton. "I loved games, and I wanted to meet other people." Those living in the country tended to have few friends, owing to the distances between similar families, although some had parents with time to spare for them. Others were left to their own devices until, with luck, they were sent to school at the age of between 12 and 14. Suzanne Irwin was one of these. "As a child, I saw a lot of my parents. I saw nobody else, really. I had my governess, Ruthie, our nanny, my pony and the dogs, and that was my life. There were no children of my sort of age nearby. I did very much miss young people." Some children were sent off for months, even years at a stretch. Diana Quilter was dispatched to Paris at the age of 12 with her older sister and a governess. "We stayed off the Avenue Victor Hugo, and I went to a lycée. They worked very hard, those French children, and I didn't know much French. For a whole term I wasn't able to do any work and sat reading Dumas on a bench outside. When I came home I did lessons with the daughter of a friend and her governess for a year, and then I was sent off to Florence. and at 17 to Bavaria to one of the old Grafins who were desperate for some hard currency. I was there 3 terms, then I was dragged back, protesting violently to do the season. Parents who...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?